Hi, everyone. In this video, I have the pleasure of having Chris Stanley of Beach Street Legal join us to talk about the latest marketing rules coming out of the SEC. As you guys may recall, a few months back, I did a video on this before a lot of the rules were solidified. So I wanted to do a refresher on it and answer many of your questions on marketing rules for investment advisors. So Chris, welcome to our show. I'm really looking forward to having you.
Me as well. I appreciate the invite and looking forward to digging right in.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe, Chris, there's been a lot of updates and amendments that I've been hearing about from the SEC coming out of the marketing rule. So if you could, please give a high-level overview of what are some of the changes that investment advisors should be aware of pertaining to this rule.
Sure. So I think it's important right out of the gate to distinguish how the rule impacts SEC registered advisors versus state registered advisors. And one of the common questions I receive, at least from state registered advisors, is what does this impact for me? And there's been a lot of open questions about how are state securities regulators going to be handling what is specifically an SEC rule that is applicable to SEC registered advisors. And so with respect to state registered firms, state securities regulators effectively fall into one of three categories. One, a particular state's rules basically defers to the SEC, and therefore testimonials are having more of an open door. Number two, states have contrary rules or their own rules, which more or less prohibit testimonials. And then a third category of states would be states that are still evaluating and potentially making changes to their rules to either adopt something similar to what the SEC has done or to make their own rule or some derivation thereof. So, don't hold your breath for states to make any sort of changes in the short term. This is a long process, et cetera. But I know it's a particularly challenging question for state registered advisors, especially those that are registered in multiple states. So I think that's one important area just to get on the table right out of the gate.
Absolutely. So what about on the SEC side? What are the major rules coming out from that perspective?
Sure. So as far as SEC registrants are concerned, the rule is in effect. We're in this sort of middle period, if you will, where the rule is effective, but the mandatory compliance date has not yet occurred, meaning that the rule was approved and went into effect in 2021. But there was a long adoption period, or I should say compliance period, if you will. And so the technical compliance date with the new marketing rule is November 4th, 2022. What that means is that advisors have the option to be an early adopter, if you will, and comply with the new marketing rule, i.e. be able to use testimonials before the November 4th, 2022 compliance date. But if they do so, it's sort of an all or nothing endeavor, meaning you have to observe all the compliance and disclosure requirements related to testimonials. You have to also importantly adhere to all the other elements of the marketing rule, which are comparatively getting lesser attention. But that is an entire half of the rule, frankly, that deals with performance advertising and how advisors advertise their performance returns. So the long and the short of it is you can certainly adopt the new marketing rule now, use testimonials, just make sure that you are prepared to comply with the entirety of the rule as it relates to the other marketing components, in particular performance advertising restrictions and obligations.
Got it. So what would be the requirements around testimonial rules? What is considered a testimonial? Because that's such a broad topic. You could have Yelp, you could have Google, Google for business reviews. You could have testimonials on your LinkedIn account. Do you have much direction on what that could entail?
Sure. So helpfully in the rule itself, there is a definition of testimonial and its counterpart, which is referred to as an endorsement. And so in the simplest sense of the term, a testimonial is something that is said about an advisory firm or an advisor by a client, whereas an endorsement is something that is said about the firm or an advisor by somebody other than a client.
Okay.
And so testimonials, again, are getting a lot of the attention, justifiably so. This is big news for those in the marketing world and the investment advisory space. Testimonials have been prohibited for decades. Importantly, there is that other distinction of endorsements, which are things that are said or written or conveyed about an advisor by non-clients. And it's in the endorsement side of the rule where we start to get more into what was formerly referred to as the cash solicitation rule and referrals or compensation for introductions by people other than advisors.
Got it. So actually the endorsement part sounds interesting as well. So you're saying that one's a little bit more hands off, that a firm can have 20 Google for Business reviews from an outsider and who's not a client, and that could be okay potentially?
Well, I mean, actually, the good news is both testimonials and endorsements are permitted. As you would expect, given it's the SEC and a regulator, it's not just complete open season and a free-for-all. There are certain ways that an advisor has to utilize testimonials, certain disclosures that have to be made. And with respect, at least to endorsements, which again is sort of the new lingo for what were formerly referred to as a solicitation type of arrangement, if there's compensation paid over a de minimis amount, there has to be an agreement between the person giving the endorsement and the RIA firm, and again, certain other disclosure requirements, due diligence requirements, et cetera. So the long and the short of it is, both are permissible in the right circumstances with the right disclosures, and so long as advisors go about it in the right way.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. It's like an open sea as far as what people could do. And people are, I guess, making their own decisions on what the risks could be if by November 2022, they are in the wrong or they're doing something right.
Yeah, and I would have hoped by this time we would have seen more FAQs or guidance or some other information around the edges, if you will, with respect to the new rule. Obviously, there's a lot of time before the mandatory compliance date, but it'll be here before we know it. But I think, at least from what I've seen, there were those that were ready and rearing to go and wanted to use things like Google reviews, Yelp, put client testimonials on their website, et cetera, and have gone down that path. And there are other advisors that are taking more of a wait and see approach to see maybe how their peers, how other firms deal with it, wait to see if the SEC is going to maybe issue a guidance alert or maybe a risk alert on how advisors are going about implementing the new marketing rule. But one thing I will notice that will be top of mind or front and center, I should say, in this first quarter of 2021 is that when SEC registered advisors go to file their annual ADV amendment, which is required for all advisors to be filed by the end of March for those that have a fiscal year end of December 31, they will see a couple new questions on the Form ADV Part 1, specifically related to the firm's marketing activities and specifically further the firm's use of testimonials, endorsements, and performance advertising. So don't be surprised, for those in the audience that are SEC registered advisors filing their ADV during this Q1, don't be surprised if you see a couple new questions in that regard. They're simple yes or no questions. You don't have to go into any sort of narrative description, but it's more or less the SEC collecting data on how advisors are marketing themselves, especially given the new permissibility in the new rule.
Yeah, I mean, personally, as a CMO to a large network of advisors, our perspective is I don't necessarily think it's a great idea to have a client's video up there with their name. Just from a competitive perspective, anyone else could actually get their information. It's not really secure for the client to be sharing their name and saying that this is the firm I work with. So my question is, can we get a video of someone talking about their experience without sharing their name and contact? And is that considered a testimonial if it could potentially be like a model and it's not really an actual person who's who's working with this firm?
Yeah, good question. And frankly, there are privacy considerations with respect to the client that are above and beyond, frankly, what is covered in the new marketing rule. And the good news is I don't have the quote exactly up in front of me or memorized, but there is a particular provision within the SEC's adopting release for the new marketing rule where they don't require disclosure of the full client's name. They don't require that any non-public information be shared about the client. So that concern is allayed, which is good. So you can still respect the client's privacy in that regard, at least from a naming perspective. You more or less just have to identify them as a client, thus fitting into the testimonial camp, as opposed to a non-client fitting into the endorsement camp. And so that sort of feeds into the second part of your question is, can you use a model or a third party that's representative of a client? And the answer, I think, would be no if you wanted to call it a testimonial, because they're not actually a client of the firm. That would be more appropriate perhaps to capture as like a case study or an example or a representation perhaps of experiences of the firm, but not an actual statement made by a literal client.
Yeah, I like that. And I think from what our conversation is, going toward, that may be what I would recommend to a lot of advisors is, hey, we don't have the full rules yet from the testimonial rule, and why risk it with the name of the client and their privacy? You've worked so hard to get this client's trust, and now you're just sharing it all away just from an advertising perspective. So my opinion is either have the client without their name disclosed, or to take it an even safer level would be to have a third party and have a disclosure saying this is not to protect our client's privacy. We've used a third party, we've used the model, but this is a communication coming directly from our client. Do you think that would cause any legal potential barriers and issues?
No, I mean, frankly, I agree with the proper disclosure that can certainly work. And I mean, personally, I've been advising clients to just get their consent in writing before using a video or a photo or a direct quote or something along those lines, because, heaven forbid the client has second thoughts or maybe didn't intend for what they said to be made public to the world. So yeah, getting client consent, I think, is advisable regardless of whether it's themselves providing the testimonial or a model providing the testimonial using their words. It just keeps everybody completely transparent as far as what expectations are.
That's great. Yeah, this is really interesting and fascinating. I wouldn't want anyone risking it and waiting until November for all the rules to finalize. More importantly, for the privacy of the client, I think it's just better safe than sorry. To see what, to get someone's perspective. But it sounds like you're saying any outsider could write a Google review on a firm, a Yelp review. I know the character of this firm and I think they're a great fit. We all know people just look at the number of stars. Any perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was some, before the new marketing rule, there was some speculation in the advisory community, the legal and compliance world, about whether an endorsement on LinkedIn or a like on Facebook or a retweet or a heart on Twitter could somehow be construed as a testimonial.
Right.
And frankly, I think the SEC has laid that issue to rest and more or less said it really doesn't implicate the rule as we had intended it. But if let's just say somebody, a client of his or her own volition, leaves a positive Google review on the firm's Google webpage, if the advisor really doesn't do anything with it, they just sort of let it park there, they don't interact with it, they don't share it, they don't really do anything with it, they haven't adopted or entangled themselves with that review, it largely doesn't implicate the bulk of what the marketing rule is intended to get at. But if the advisor does adopt or entangle him or herself with respect to what a client says on a Google profile, like giving it 5 stars or saying positive things, and wants to excerpt that on the website or retweet it or post it to LinkedIn, that's where the advisor has more or less converted that to the advisor's own marketing material, and therefore would be subject to various disclosure, record keeping, and the other full bore obligations of the rule. So, the good news is for all these third party sites, there's a lot more leeway and I think a lot more guidance in that respect. Again, I don't want to paint the picture that it's completely a free for all, because there's requirements that have to go along with it, but there's a lot more permissibility and a lot more creativity, I think, that can be brought to bear for how these reviews are utilized.
Absolutely. And then the second part of what I wanted to talk about was just the cash solicitation rules. And I just wanted to find out, let's say you have a number of real estate agents in your community that sell high-end luxury real estate, and you want to find a way to collaborate with them. What is the new rule for cash solicitation? Can you give this person ongoing recurring fees for having referred their client without that real estate agent going and getting their, Series 7 license and things like that?
So with respect to the cash solicitation rule, or what I should refer to as the former cash solicitation rule, the SEC actually rescinded the rule in its entirety, but folded many of its principal tenets into the new marketing rule. So what was formerly two rules, the advertising rule and the cash solicitation rule, are now one consolidated rule. So insofar as solicitation activity or referral activity going forward, advisors should look to the new consolidated marketing rule as their principal point of guidance and instruction. And just for clarification of terminology, the SEC has started to use the term promoter instead of solicitor. So in case you see that terminology tossed around in the rule or in other material, that's what that's referring to. But to get right to your question, not a whole lot has changed with respect to who is eligible to receive compensation from an advisor for referring clients or soliciting clients. There have been certain changes, and actually for advisors, less of a workload in that a solicitor disclosure document and client attestation are no longer required, and an agreement, if it's below de minimis compensation, is not even required. But what the core issue still is for, let's say, a real estate agent, is whether the real estate agent is appropriately licensed or qualified to receive cash compensation for client referrals under their particular state's securities rules. And this is a little bit convoluted, but the SEC doesn't regulate natural persons or individuals. And so if an individual like a real estate agent is to get compensation from an advisor for referring clients to that advisory firm, that real estate agent would still have to look to various state securities rules to determine, do I fit within the definition of investment advisor representative? Because if I do, then there are certain qualification, licensing, and registration requirements that might apply. So most, but not all, but most states have within their definition of investment advisor rep, or IAR, that if you solicit new advisory business for an RIA and receive cash compensation or compensation for those activities, that fits within the definition of an IAR, and therefore somebody that has to be appropriately qualified, licensed, and registered. In other words, you're talking Series 65, or you're talking a professional designation exemption like a CFP or CFA. There are some states that say, we don't require the registration or the qualification of non-licensed, non-registered persons that receive compensation for referrals. So in those states, there's not a problem. But as you can see, it becomes a patchwork very, very quickly. And I will say, sort of as a footnote to this, that there is a small carve out specifically for SEC registered firms where federal preemption would apply if an IAR becomes a supervised person of the firm and a couple other T's are crossed and I's are dotted. But for truly independent folks, like an independent real estate agent, unfortunately, you still have to go through that state by state web to figure out, am I legally entitled to receive compensation for client referrals?
But you said the de minimis payment is okay.
So insofar as de minimis compensation, I believe it's less than $1,000 on an annual basis. It doesn't trigger the need under the new marketing rule for an agreement or for certain other hoops to jump through under the new marketing rule. There is no equivalent de minimis threshold for the various states, at least that I'm aware of, for those states that consider solicitation activity to be included within the definition of IAR. So even if somebody like a real estate agent received $500 for referring a client to an investment advisory firm, that real estate agent would still have to go through the analysis, is this enough to trigger licensing, registration, qualification, et cetera, or is there some other way that I can fall under an exemption or take advantage of the federal preemption for SEC registered firms?
Yeah. So from what I'm hearing, the cash solicitation or promoter is still convoluted and better stay away, because whoever you're thinking of paying has to go through hoops to really be able to get paid.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to stay away, but I would tread lightly.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, in your example, it's really the real estate agent's obligation to determine his or herself, am I subject to receiving this compensation? And you can make an argument that that is solely the real estate agent's obligation and their liability if a regulator finds out and decides to take an adverse action. But I wouldn't want to advise an advisor to turn a willful blind eye to pay somebody that they know is not entitled to receive the fee. So it's a bit of a tightrope.
Yeah.
But I mean, frankly, some firms and some individuals have said, we think that this COI, this real estate agent, this person, this firm is going to be such a wealth of referrals that it's actually worth bringing them on as an IAR just for solicitation purposes, or having them set up their own RIA just for solicitation purposes. Yeah. Obviously, you have to go through the registration process. You have to take and pass the Series 65. You're subject to exam by the state, yada, yada, yada. So it's not not an easy path, but it is an option if the ROI is there.
Yeah. And if a firm has a few of those COIs that they want to kind of shake those trees and get a lot of mutual benefits out of, that's where they could contact you to set up some sort of agreement and check their state and see what the individual rules of that state are.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, this is one of the most convoluted areas in terms of registration and requirements. I mean, it was before the rule. It continues to be after the rule. We'll see what various states do. I mean, there's even going to be some sort of awkward period during this transition where if you look to states' rules, it's not entirely clear how you're supposed to comply. Because, for example, if you look to Florida's rules say, oh, as long as you're following the federal cash solicitation rule, you're deemed to be in compliance with Florida's rules.
Right.
Well, the federal cash solicitation rule doesn't exist any longer. So exactly. Where does that leave us? So it's going to take some shaking out before this is all settled. But, my advice is, at least for those individuals or firms that are looking to get compensated for client referrals, just be mindful that there might be some hoops to jump through before you can start cashing those checks.
Exactly. That sounds like a perfect idea. Well, Chris, this has been incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it. And for anyone who's watching this and would like to get creative around some of these updates on the rules from a marketing perspective, or would like to check your marketing approach through Chris's firm as far as the legalities of it, please do feel free to reach out. You could find all of our contact information below. And I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you.